Welcome everyone to another of our Route 66 and Ozarks oral history projects. My name is Tom Peters. I'm the Dean of Libraries at Missouri State University. Today's date is September 9th, 2015, and our special guest today is John T. Woodruff III, who, among other things, is the grandson of John T. Woodruff, who was involved in a lot of projects in the greater Springfield and Ozarks region. So, JT, welcome.
Thank you.
And we're in JT's home here in Springfield. So we're just chatting about, JT's life and his father David's life and John T. Woodruff I's life and other aspects of the family because, for the record, I'm working on a biography of John T. Woodruff I, and I'm just very impressed and fascinated by this particular family. So, again, thank you.
And I'd be glad to give you all the information I can certainly come up with.
Okay. Well, one thing I've been looking for that I haven't discovered yet is if your grandfather's papers still exist, and if so, where they are.
I believe when my grandfather retired from the Springfield public life, he relocated to Siloam Springs,
Yep.
Missouri,
Mm-hmm.
which is roughly about 20 miles outside of West Plains.
Mm-hmm.
And he built a beautiful southern style home there that actually my dad took me down to.
Oh, really? So
when I was young.
You visited Pinebrook Inn.
I have visited Pinebrook Inn. It was not. It was just an old building when I went down. It was uninhabited
Mm-hmm.
and grown over and so forth. But the Pinebrook Inn was this beautiful old hotel, from the late 20s, 30s.
Mm-hmm.
That and I'm not sure when it was built. He died in the 50s, early 50s. So it was probably built in what do you think, the 40s?
I think it was the late 20s, actually.
Okay. Well,
another developer had started it. This is at least what I've learned.
Okay, well, you
and then,
you may know more than I, because, of course, my grandfather was deceased when I was born, so I never knew him, but I heard all the stories from my dad.
uh-huh.
And, I was young and I didn't really care to listen, so some soaked in and some went right over my head.
Yeah. Well, your dad is well known in the Springfield area.
Right.
And the Woodruff Award is given in honor of your father's
That's correct.
work with
That's correct.
Juveniles, especially juvenile
Correct.
delinquents
Right.
in the greater Springfield area.
Right.
And there is a plaque, I'm sure you know, that's up in the Greene County Juvenile Center, I guess
Correct.
it's called. That summarizes some of his amazing achievements. I think he worked as a juvenile officer for 32 years.
32 years.
Yeah. And he was
yeah.
the first under a new law. I think there was a new law
Right.
in Missouri, like 45. And
He went to law school at the University of Missouri. And after law school, was the circuit clerk in Springfield in Greene County for a few years. Went into the FBI.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Spent a couple of years in the FBI. Was in the military. Reached the rank of colonel.
Yeah, he was in the
And-
Army,
Philippines,
Philippines.
and it was in the engineer corps.
Okay.
So they were blowing things up.
I want to come back to that because I have a good
Okay.
question about that. But anyway, so.
So and then spent 32 years in working, with the juvenile court, and was the director of juvenile court services. But was just, my mom said in later years that he was a brilliant attorney and could have done any number of things. In fact, he was John Holston's roommate at Missouri, and there were cards made up that Holston and Woodruff law practice cards, but he just never went that route. And John Halston was very successful in doing private law, but my dad chose something that was that he really felt he made a difference in doing.
And from everything I read, he had a tremendous impact on
Right.
Juvenile delinquency and just the development of youth in the
Right.
Springfield region.
Right,
and,
right.
He seemed particularly apt at doing this. It was just
Right.
very
And
very committed
and that's right. And was given numerous awards and
yeah.
just really loved his work.
Yeah. And he passed away at a fairly early age, 62.
He did. He passed away at 62 of a brain aneurysm and had been in a meeting in Jefferson City all day with the governor and came home, had dinner with my mom, and there were policemen at the house talking to him about a case when it happened.
Oh, really?
So he had immediate care, but it was just time.
Yeah, yeah. So your mom's maiden name was Catherine Gibson?
That's correct.
Okay. She go by Cassie?
She went by Cass.
Cass, okay. And evidently they met at Drury? They were both students?
No, actually, they met early on in their lives, and my mother and her family lived on one corner of I think it was Elm Street, and my father and his family lived on right across the street, right across National, on the other corner.
Okay.
So they were friends.
They almost like playmates.
Early on.
Yeah.
And then went to Drury, and my dad went through Drury in 3 years.
Okay.
He and his brother were both went to Drury and were members of Kappa Alpha, and my mom was a Pi Phi, and then my dad went through law school and came back to Springfield, and they were married then.
Okay. Back to his military service, I read somewhere that he was captain at one point in his career of a Negro ammunition company.
That's right. I think back then at World War II, everybody enlisted over at the military hospital, which I think was the O'Reilly Hospital.
Right, on Glenstone.
On Glenstone, and is it Division?
Yeah, just south of Division.
Right.
Yeah.
So went through his training, and since he was an attorney, he was automatically a lieutenant. They offered him a promotion to captain if he would accept this all-Negro company, and did so, and said that he had the best men in the military.
Yeah.
And
so he's very proud to be
their
leader.
of those guys, and and it was a time when most people would have just said no, and the back then things were so much different than they are today.
Yeah, right. And I know with your grandfather, overall there were sometimes people will say stuff in letters and things that I don't think most of us would feel comfortable saying today.
Right.
But I think even your grandfather, when he moved from St. Louis down to Springfield, he had a African-American assistant of some sort.
Right.
And he so admired him, he offered him a job if he would come with him. And the man thought about it and said, no, I'd rather stay here in St. Louis. But, he had somebody in his office who was an African-American, and he so valued his work that when he transferred down here, he offered to have this gentleman come down. And so...
right, and he was he actually... I'm drawing a blank. There's a town, Steelville, I believe.
Steelville, yeah.
Steelville.
Yeah.
There's a little a museum there that has quite a few articles on him.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I may have a book that they sent me.
I'll check Steelville. I was up in Cuba earlier this month, I guess, or maybe it was last month, at the Crawford County Historical Museum, and they had
Right.
some stuff on the
Right.
family.
I'll give you the book before you leave.
All right, appreciate
bring
it.
it back.
I appreciate it. I'll bring it back. So there's just, I'm fairly far in. I think I'm probably going to finish this book, probably going to self-publish it because I'm
Right.
tenured. I don't need to go through all the hoops anymore.
Right.
I just want to get it out there. And so I pretty well finished, but I've got some sort of nagging issues that I haven't. It's like where his papers are. Nobody
Right.
seems to know where his,
Well,
if his papers
I
are
think that when we started on this, on where the papers were,
Yeah.
and we got off track, but I think that the papers were lost somewhere in the move to Siloam Springs.
Yeah.
My dad did have, his biography,
Mm-hmm.
and had it typed,
Yep.
and it was all, handwritten and hard to read.
Mm-hmm.
But
Did you see the handwritten? Did you ever see the handwritten copy?
no,
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know where it is.
Okay.
It's
We've got some versions of the typewritten copy.
right. The actual copy, the original typewritten copy, I donated to the History Museum.
Okay.
John Sellers has control of it down there, so
Yeah. Actually, we at the MSU libraries were housing some of their archives for them because they're working on a renovation
Right,
project.
right.
So I think I've probably seen
Okay.
the original.
Well, I loaned it to SMS years ago, and they read through it, and
Yeah, somebody
And-
photocopied it, so we've got.
I'm sure.
We've got a
I'm
couple
sure you do.
copies now. So
I'm sure you do.
We're actually planning to digitize it as
Oh,
well.
great,
you know,
great.
if it's, unless you object.
No,
right?
not at all. And there is that book that
Yeah, Steve Ellen,
Steve Ellen.
92, I want to say.
Right.
He edited it and, edited out some stuff. It was, whenever you can compare the original against the edit, I had some reason. Why did he leave out that sentence? Why
right.
did
Well, there were some parts of that book, and generally most of that book was pretty dry. And there were, it wasn't written to be entertaining.
No.
He was pretty serious, and
I've read that he was, I've seen accounts where he rarely smiled in public.
No,
He was just a very focused, serious,
that's
very
right.
civic-minded.
And the pictures that I have seen of him, I have never once seen him smile.
I think I'll double check, but I ran across one picture where I think he was smoking a cigar, and he was kind of leaning back, and he kind of had a smile on his face.
Well,
So if I run across it again, I'll make sure they.
I promised you that I would pull out some family pictures, and I haven't.
Okay.
But I know where they are,
Okay.
and I will,
And
I will get those to you.
and we'd love to digitize. I mean, one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to do a better job of sort of documenting and preserving Ozark's history. And
Right.
So certainly
Well,
your
I
father
think
and your
that's great.
grandfathers are their efforts and achievements are definitely part of Ozark's history.
Right.
Another thing that a couple things about your family's lives. Back in 1929, early 1929, before the stock market crash, your grandfather sold the Woodruff building to FX Heer. And part of the deal was the Woodruff family took ownership of a home south of town on the James River called Killarney Cliffs.
That's correct.
And actually there's some photographs that I'm pretty sure were taken at Killarney Cliffs. But I can't find any indication that the family ever lived there.
Well, they did.
Okay.
And, until recently, that had kind of gone into the back of my feeble memory bank. But I remember my mother and father were talking to me about, because we drove, there were so many homes that he built and owned in Springfield
Yeah.
that we would drive around, and they would show those to me, and we were out in that part of the county, and my dad was talking about it, and the gate was closed, or generally he would just drive right up, and so many people knew him that it was just okay. So he was saying that his mother hated that house, and I said, well, it's so big and it's so pretty, why would she hate it? He said, well, she turned the faucet on and a snake came out. And that house was, my grandfather loved it because it had such a great view, and he had plans on doing more out there.
Yeah.
But they moved out pretty quickly.
Yeah. Okay. But they did live there.
They did live there. They lived there not long, and I don't know how long, but they moved from there.
Another house that I know your grandfather built, but I'm not sure if the family ever lived there, it's still standing. It's on Glenstone Avenue on the west side. It's now an attorney's office.
I was going to mention that. They did
live there. All right.
And, my grandfather built that house, and, it was beautiful. And it still is. I mean, the architecture, just and the stonework is just beautiful. They built that, my grandfather built it, for a family home. They owned the property all behind it. So there used to be a huge lot back there, even when I grew up.
I can imagine.
And behind that, on Kentwood and Delmar, there's that triangle out there. Yeah. My grandfather donated that to the city and said, you can never do anything with it. If you do anything to it, it reverts back to ownership of the family. And of course, we don't want it, so please don't do anything to it. But they have just mowed it. I wish they'd plant some trees and maybe put some benches, but that may be something I have to do to
and then
that.
didn't your grandfather and your father's family live just west of that house in a single story kind of ranch house that was I think it was on Kentwood, just on the west of.
That's right. They did build that house and lived there, and it was more of a cottage look, but it had a huge front yard.
Yeah.
And I've been in the house, and it's more of a casual house in relation to the other homes that they lived in.
Yeah. Well, we're on the home, so they also lived east of town at where now the Hickory Hills Golf Course is.
Right.
And my sense is that he built the golf course while they were living there. At least the first 9 holes.
It was actually, that property was the family farm.
Yeah.
And my dad and my dad and my uncle both were phenomenal golfers. My dad especially. And they developed it into a golf course. All on, now Hickory Hills is on both sides of Cherry, but then it was all 18 were just there. And as you turn in the drive at Hickory Hills, on the right-hand side, there was a 2-story white house.
That was the family farm.
That was the family farmhouse. And it actually stayed there until, I was in college, I think, or maybe after, when it was finally torn down.
Really? Sorry to go back, but I was going to mention the Pinebrook Inn burned down a few years ago.
It did, and I was notified that morning, and I kind of had plans because the family that owned it had really fixed it up, and over the years, different people had owned it, and I had friends in West Plains, and they'd call and they'd say, hey, it's been redone again. So I drive down there. I've been down there a few times and looked at it. But, backing up a little bit more, when I was probably 13 or 14 and still not to the point where I had to be out on my own and didn't want to be with my parents.
Right.
My dad and mom and I just took a drive and went down to Pinebrook. And actually there was there was a guy that was probably 90 when we went to his house. It was at the corner of the property, and he had lived there since my grandfather owned the property, and was actually the caretaker that my grandfather hired, and remembered my dad. And
Yeah, I think I may know. I can't dredge it up from memory, but I
can't
think I've
think
run
of his
across
name.
his name because
right,
your grandfather, he had like a, I want to say like a horticulturist who was out there on staff.
Right.
And,
yeah, and there was actually a golf course there.
Yeah. A
So-
lake.
A lake,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So when we got there, the guy said, yeah, he gave us the key, and he said, you guys, you've got the run. Just do whatever you want. The bank owned it, and was still. So we went down there, and we kind of walked the golf course. Of course, it was grown up with. You couldn't tell it was a golf course, or had ever been a golf course. And my dad showed me where the different tee boxes and greens had been, and you could kind of make it out with knowing that what it was. But we looked at the house and walked through, and of course it was not in great repair, but it was huge.
Yeah.
And it was pretty. You could tell the workmanship was.
I think he had some Italian workers come on and do some work out there.
That wouldn't surprise me.
When he was building it.
Right,
so,
and it was. So he really just retired there.
Yeah.
And
he had heart trouble, I think.
He did, and he just did not want to come back to. He felt like the life that he'd have in Springfield had been pretty harsh. Towards the end, and just didn't want to come back.
Yeah. It is amazing. I mentioned that there's just a lot of newspaper articles about your grandfather, but during the Depression years, not so much. And I know he in his Reminiscences he talks about how he lost Hickory Hills to he called them like a pack of wolves who'd wanted it for a long time.
Right.
Kind of comment, and but he was very proud of the fact he never declared bankruptcy. But I'm pretty sure for the kind of things he was involved in that the Depression years were really tough on him.
Well, there were, as my dad said, there were things that he could have done to come out of that just fine.
Yeah.
But my grandfather did not believe in alcohol, and Prohibition had just gone through, and alcohol was legal, and there were bars and all the hotels, and he would not serve alcohol in any of his restaurants.
I did not know that. He just did not believe that alcohol should be consumed.
Would not allow it.
Yeah.
And my dad said that for that reason, and that reason alone, because everything else, was maybe not making the kind of money that it had, but was getting by.
Yeah.
He just.
Did they live at the Kentwood Arms for a while?
They did.
Yeah.
In fact, this sofa is from their apartment in the Kentwood Arms.
Really? That is a classic.
As is this chair over here.
Let me swing this over and see if I can.
And I'm sorry, my dog has jumped on it and messed up my pillows.
But that is a classy sofa.
And as well as the red chair over there.
Okay, I'll get that later. A couple things just about the family and marriages and stuff. Your grandfather was married twice.
That's correct.
Do you know much about Jessie May Doak?
No, only that she passed away.
Yeah, she passed away, I believe it was 9 months after Jessie
was born.
And she's buried in Cuba Cemetery, I believe, on the west side of Cuba. I was looking for it the other day and I couldn't find the gravestone. But there's enough indication that that's where she was buried. It must have been terrible for your grandfather to lose his wife. He was a Frisco attorney, living in St. Louis. I'm sure he had to do a lot of travel. All of a sudden he's a widower with a young girl, daughter, and he's lost his wife. Did anybody ever tell stories about how did he manage?
They didn't. And, that may have figured into the reason that he was not a happy person. But I don't know.
Yeah. I just don't know, but I can't imagine.
You know, travel back then was not exactly easy. If you weren't on the railroad, you were not moving very fast.
A lot of overnight travel, I imagine.
A lot of overnight travel.
Because you just couldn't get out and back in a day.
That's correct.
So we spent a lot of time traveling around. Then the other thing I'm not sure about is your uncle, John T. Woodruff II, died very young. 49?
49.
Yeah.
He was the postmaster.
Yeah.
And had a liver disease and passed away young.
How many times was he married?
Just once.
All right. Because I read a report that he divorced and remarried before he died.
Well, you're right. He did. He was married to Jean Cossey.
Yeah.
And they had one daughter, Jill.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived on Lone Pine and at Battlefield and owned all that property there. And then, you know, where the house that, you know, it's been in the press a lot lately.
The African house?
The African house. Yeah. Well, along the side of that, there's a driveway that actually goes up into the back. And there's 8 acres back there with 2 Don Russell houses on it.
Really?
And he lived back there.
Oh.
And he and Jean were divorced, and he remarried. And I really don't know much about, you know, we weren't really around.
I don't know much either. I think it was like, you know, if he died at 49, it would have been about maybe age 46 that he got the divorce, remarried maybe within a year or two, and then he died.
Right.
You know? So it was like right at, he didn't know it, but it was at the end, near the end of his life.
Right, and I know where he lived, but I can't really remember a lot about the family. I know that he didn't have any children with the woman he married, the second wife, but she did have kids, and you know, they go by Woodruff, but I don't really know them.
And you're a lifelong resident of Springfield?
I am. I moved away for about 3 years. Went to Kansas City. My job, the company I worked for, closed their office here and sent me on a temporary assignment to Kansas City, and the next thing I knew, it was permanent assignment. So I was living up there.
Yeah. How'd you enjoy Kansas City?
Well, I really enjoyed it at first because for the first 6 months I lived in the Ritz-Carlton.
Oh.
So, you know, my company just said, "Listen, we'll just set you up your choice of hotels. We just really appreciate you being up there," and it was close to my office, so we struck a deal with the hotel, and you know, I started off in a closet-sized room and made friends at the hotel, and when I checked out, I was on a suite on the concierge level. For this, you know, so I really, it was actually like living like a king, because every morning I'd come out and my car was running underneath the canopy, and I would just step in it and go to work. So I was actually a little sad when they said, "Well, there's we can make this job for you, this district manager job in Kansas City permanent, or we can look at sending you to the East Coast." And I thought, too far. Yeah. Too cold. Yeah. Too snobby. I'm staying here.
Exactly.
So I stayed for 3 years.
Yeah. Okay. Then you came back here.
I did. You know, I'm an only child, so my mother was, you know, reaching those twilight years, and I really felt like I didn't want to be away if she needed me.
Yeah. She lived a long, full life.
She did, and she was a housewife until I went to Drury. And one of our best friends, or one of my parents' closest friends, were John and Jenny Morris, and they owned the Brown Derby stores.
Mm-hmm.
And their young son John
Mm-hmm.
was wanting to get into the fishing tackle business.
Mm-hmm.
So John's dad told him that he thought it would be a good idea to see if my mother would help him with his buying.
Really? I didn't know
And she, in her early life, had been a buyer for Allied department stores, which out of New York,
Mhm.
and she would go back and forth on the train, and so she became a clothing buyer for Bass Pro, or for John, and was the sixth person. There were 6 people that worked there.
Wow.
And then stayed and watched it grow, and
She enjoyed.
loved it,
Yeah.
loved every minute of it. And when she turned 65, she retired, and at about 66 she was back at work, and worked until she was 85.
Wow.
When she died.
Wow.
And she just loved it, and she and John were the best of friends.
Yeah.
And John even named his daughter Megan. Her middle name's Cass.
Really.
So we spent lots of fun time together, and just
Yeah.
they considered my mom and I family, and we felt the same and still do about them.
Yeah. Well, good. I did not know that there was
Yeah.
that connection. Did your family ever talk about your grandfather's involvement with the birth and development of Route 66?
Some.
It was part of the family history. that
Right,
Granddad was
and then
involved
that was
in.
probably something that I could have cared less about at the time. My dad took me to, all the places that my grandfather had built and owned, and I spent time in the Kentwood before it became part of the college, and we went up to the old suite, and my dad, he actually worked there when he was in Drury.
Yeah. Yeah.
And worked the desk clerk and worked the all-night shift, which he just hated, but he said, my dad made me work just like I was anybody.
Yeah.
I wasn't just the owner's son, I was the owner's son that worked the night shift. And he said nothing was any different for me than it was for anybody else. So I went all through the Kentwood and through the Colonial and through the Woodruff building, and he built the Sandstone.
Sandstone, yeah. I was just in there the other day.
It's been, I don't know if have they done anything to it.
Yeah, they've turned them into like micro apartments, but you still get a sense of the way it was.
Right.
The staircase is still like the old staircase.
Yeah, and it was all boarded up, so I didn't get in there. But growing up, we lived next door to the Heer family, so we had a connection with the
Yeah.
Heers, and
Do you have any sense about in your grandfather's time? Was there a friendly rivalry between the Heers and the Woodruffs, or was it?
I don't.
What was the relationship there?
I don't know, because we were such close friends with that family.
Uh-huh.
My godmother is one of the Heers' daughters,
Oh, okay.
and I just don't think there may have been with the fathers, but there sure weren't with the kids.
Okay. Do you like to golf?
I used to play a lot of golf, and in fact, up until I was probably 35, I played golf 3 or 4 times a week, and that's about when my career became upward, and I was moving up. I didn't have really the time. Then I developed this terrible hook, which just made me mad. And I went back to all my old teachers. Of course, my dad had been my biggest teacher, but I went back to all the teachers at Hickory Hills, and they could straighten it out, and then it would go right back. And where the friends that I used to beat weekly were killing me. And I thought I just need to take a break, because this is not working out well for me right now.
And you're still on break, huh?
Well, I am still on break, and my dad took the same break.
Really?
And he didn't start playing golf again until he was about 58.
Really?
He actually held the course record at Hickory Hills until I think a pro took it.
Yeah.
Back when the Payne Stewart tournament was out there, a few years after Payne's death, one of the tour players beat the record, but he held a record of 62 on Hickory Hills Country Club.
Yeah. There's a lot of people suggest that your grandfather brought golf to the Ozarks, that he was the guy who
maybe. I mean, there weren't many golf courses, and there was where the country club center is, over on Glenstone. That was a country club community.
Yeah.
A golf course there.
Yep.
And,
I think the Depression, they disbanded during the Depression.
And I grew up in that neighborhood over there on Delaware.
Yeah. So your grandfather's second wife was Lydia Brand.
That's correct.
Any family memories of Lydia and her side of the family?
I really didn't know her either, because she passed away just a few months.
Yeah, about 6 months after her husband passed away.
And my dad said that she was German, spoke very little English, was very hard to understand.
Yeah, I know she
but
grew
definitely
up in Lamar.
got her point across.
Yeah, grew up in Lamar. Was she involved in any of her husband's business activities? Do you know?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
She was pretty much a housewife and stayed pretty close to home.
Yeah. Jessie married a doctor, and they moved up to Duluth, where actually that's where your grandfather died, was in Duluth, Minnesota.
Right.
Any family memories of the Colbys? Colbys, yeah.
Well, my dad was probably closest with my Aunt Jess.
Really?
And we took some summer trips up to Duluth, and they had a couple of kids, or I think they had 2 sons.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And then they had some, sons of their own that were about my age, and, we had
so you'd
had
play
fun,
with them,
and, and I'd stay there at Jess's, at their house, for a while, and she would come down, her and her husband would come down and visit occasionally, not very often.
And then Susan married a man named Pinkerton.
That's right.
And they moved to Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh?
And I
don't know much about that.
Don't know much about that.
Any stories in the family about the old days, post-Civil War in Crawford County?
I have no recollection.
Okay.
In fact, I don't think they went back that far.
Your great-grandfather evidently built the Bourbon Hotel in Bourbon, Missouri, which is still standing. I need to go up there and take a photo of it. But
maybe we ought to run up there together.
There we go. So, he homesteaded your great-great-grandfather and his wife, Susan Rowland.
Right.
Homesteaded. They were real young when they had John. They'd just been married 9.5 months, and I think she might have been 16 or 17 when she had John. No, it was a different time.
Oh, different times, right?
Different time, but they were really young when they. So John was the first of John the First was the first oldest of 4 sons of George Washington and Susan. Do you ever hear any stories about the other, your grandfather's brothers? Lester, did Lester ever? Lester's the one I can't find much about. He went out to Oregon. He may have had some marital problems, it's kind of hard to tell. Had a daughter, I believe, died in Oregon, maybe Portland. I found a newspaper report that he was a member of a regatta team in Portland, had some kind of a regatta, and he was on a 4-man scull. And I just can't find much about Lester.
Right, I don't know enough about my grandfather, and I don't know anything about his siblings.
All right. Well, I'd be happy to. I'm about to the point where I feel that, I'm going to show it to John Sellers, anybody who really want to read it. If you want to read it.
Oh, absolutely.
Early draft. And, your grandfather got sued a couple of times, but
sure.
Kind of par for the course, I'd say.
I'd say that in...
Doing the kind of things he was
sure.
doing, he typically got sued. It's sort of the, generally he was, I didn't know he was a teetotaler. I knew he wasn't, I'll tell you the thing that gripes me. I just read a book last night that happens so often it just irks me every time I run across it. Anybody talking about Route 66 and the birth and development of Route 66, if you look at find a book and you look in the index and Cyrus Avery is mentioned, 50 times. Often John T. Woodruff, 0. And I even saw, the articles of incorporation for the U.S. Highway 66 Association were filed in Greene County, Missouri. And Cyrus Avery was not an officer, he was not a signatory to those articles of incorporation. Your grandfather was the first president. And here I am reading this book last night, and they're talking about Avery, he started the U.S. Highway 66. Well, he was involved, but no mention of your grandfather.
He was involved from Tulsa.
Right.
And
he's generally acknowledged as the father of Route 66, but your grandfather was very much involved. And he wasn't a Johnny-come-lately. He was involved back in the Ozarks Trails Association and Coin Harvey down in Arkansas. He worked at it for a long time, and he was, the 8-mile district where they were developing roads, feeder roads into farm-to-market roads, I guess we call them today, into Springfield. He was out there. He was doing things. He developed a plan for boulevards in Greene County. The road I live on, Farmer 181, was one of the proposed boulevard roads, which just tickles me no end. But he was a good roads advocate from day one, and he did a lot.
And donated, property around town.
Yeah.
I think donated some of the property for the Missouri Teachers College.
Yeah, and the story I've heard and read is that the site selection team was going around to various places. Marshfield was one location. They were they had a list of possible sites. I think they had 3 sites in Springfield. That plot of land was not on the short list, and they were just going north on National in a buggy, and somebody said, hey, what about this spot over here? Looks pretty good. And your grandfather was like a third owner of that piece of property, and the rest is history. He was also involved in designing and building Carrington Hall. He was one of the first fiscal officers of the normal school number 4, and he did a lot.
Yeah, a few years ago they gave me a picture of the university back years ago, and I had that in my office for years.
Yeah. He was on the Board of Governors, or whatever they're called, Board of Trustees of Drury College. Raised a lot of money for Drury College. So he was a big supporter of education in general. But he's also, he often kind of chuckled. I don't know if he chuckled, but he would say, I never received a degree from any institution whatsoever.
Well, I think, back when he became an attorney,
He never went to law school. He just studied under a lawyer, took the bar exam, passed. You're a lawyer.
He's smart.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the bar exam is not and was not a simple feat for anyone.
No, and he did it like in 9 months.
Right.
Less than a year. He went from basically clerking for an attorney to passing the bar exam.
Right.
You mentioned a while back that I thought I heard you say that you thought your grandfather led an unhappy life. Do you think he was fundamentally unhappy?
You know, I don't know that he was unhappy. You know, I think maybe because of the facial expressions that we've seen, it makes him look like he was unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what really drove him, you know, the things that made him the happiest were things like Route 66, like the hotels,
Right.
you know, the making the helping the city grow.
I think he was very civic-minded.
I think he was.
He was.
That was his main focus was, and that's what pleased him. I don't know that anything ever made him happy.
Yeah.
But it pleased him that he was
very civic-minded, you know, and this notion of boosterism back in the late 19th, early 20th. I mean, there are a lot of people that say, "Oh, my town's better than your town," but he was well beyond that. I think he had this vision. He knew strategically what a town had to do to grow, and for 40 years, when he came to Springfield in 1904 to about 44, by that point he was kind of transitioning to the last stage of his life. He just worked at it and accomplished this amazing list of accomplishments.
I really feel, you know, in reading and listening and that he was just a little ahead of his time.
Yeah.
You know,
some people kind of thought he was just like a dreamer.
That's right. And you know, when people think that you're a dreamer, they don't really take you that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Although he did get a lot done, and you know, there's a great legacy there. If he would have had the buy-in from the public, it would have been amazing.
Yeah. I think the public, and I think, you know, I've read reports that when he built the Woodruff building, some of his other businessmen in town said, he'll never fill that. He'll never rent all that space, and he did.
Mm-hmm.
When he built the Kentwood Arms, there were a significant number of business people in town that said, at that time, that was considered way out, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Hotels were downtown, not out there on the fringe. They said, oh, he'll never fill that. And it became the premier hotel in the region for years, decades. I'm not sure that Siloam Springs was ever a financial success.
It never was.
Yeah. I could tell just the way he was advertising it. I mean, I could tell he was kind of struggling to make that a financial success.
It wasn't. It was just more of a place to retire.
Yeah.
Just to relax.
I mean, I think he had high hopes initially, but then he said, oh, okay. Well,
it was just too far out.
This will be our summer home.
I mean, it wasn't easy to get to.
No, I know. And he
the
tried
first
hard.
place. Yeah.
He tried hard to get the Frisco to run lines, special trains to West
Mm-hmm.
Plains, and then he'd have a jitney come and pick him up, and it just didn't seem to work. He was also involved in a lot of, he was a strong advocate for dams. And I don't know if you knew this, but he was so involved in what became Table Rock Dam, he didn't live to see it built, that there was a strong contingent, it wasn't just a few people, there was a strong contingent suggested it should be called Woodruff Dam. Did you know that? What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I think that what I've experienced is, you know, there was a lot of people wanted the new juvenile justice building named after my dad.
Mm-hmm.
But the county commission at the time said, there's already a Woodruff building.
Mm.
It'll be confusing.
Mm.
And I wish that there was more recognition for my granddad. You know, something like the dam would have been going on for decades.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, it's spilt milk now.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that he did so much, and there's some people here that really should know better that don't even know who he was.
Right.
You know, that's I'm not trying to make money off of your granddad's achievements.
No, that's okay.
But I want people to know what he did, and that's the main thing. Speaking of things that he did, and Any tales rattle around in the family about Camdenton?
Yeah. When I was in college, I dated a girl from Camdenton,
Oh, really?
and my mom said, "Well, you know that your granddad donated the land that the courthouse is on in Camdenton."
Yeah.
And well, I kind of kept that in my pocket, and I was up there visiting her family, for a weekend, and we were having dinner, and I blew that out, and her mother said, "Oh no, that's not right."
Yeah.
Well, I don't think her mom really liked me anyway, so that aggravated me. So I came home, got all the
Yeah, he did
documentation.
He did more than that. He and his brother William and the two local folks from Camden County, those four gentlemen basically built Camdenton. They laid it out. They got the water system, sewer in place, and your grandfather named Camdenton. He had a contest, and I don't know how many entries he got, but he said, "Well, we need a name that's unique," and there was no Camdenton in the United States. It was Camden County, so he came up with the name, as he did with Glenstone Avenue and a lot of other places in town.
Well, once I went back and with all my documentation, I wasn't even welcome there anymore. I guess I had guilted her mother and made her look bad. So,
well, don't feel bad, because I've talked to people in Camdenton, and they're like, "I don't know who John Woodruff is," and he was one of the developers of Camden.
I think there was maybe some people that lived there that were part of that.
Yeah.
And they remember those names.
Yeah.
But they don't remember anyone else's name.
Yeah.
I think that was the whole.
And William, his brother, did a lot of work with John T. on.
Right.
He was kind of a construction person.
Right.
Did a lot of work. So let's see what else I wanted to ask you about. I'm just like, oh wow, you're giving me all these answers to things I've wondered for so long. Died in Duluth. Must have driven on 65. I think your grandfather was almost as proud of 65 as he was of 66. That he got 65, so he called Springfield the crossroads of America.
That's right.
Because those two major.
Well, and can you imagine where Springfield would be right now?
Yeah.
If 44 or 66
Yeah.
and 65 were not. The crossroads were maybe in Marshfield.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, that.
And if the fourth normal school had gone somewhere else. And
That's right.
when I talk about your grandfather, I'll often, I have a slide that lists what I consider his major accomplishments. And the first one I list is the Frisco maintenance repair shops. And I stopped there and I said, if he hadn't done anything else, there should be a statue for this man in this town, because that alone basically made this town what it is. I suggest, And I see a lot of people who know more than I do about this, local histories, they're nodding their heads. And then I go on and I say, he was not just on the committee. That's the thing that I really admire. I know your grandfather better than I know you and your dad, so I'm not.
Oh, it's okay.
It's not like he was just a member of whatever. He was the guy. There's always the one person that, in any group effort, in my experience, that really makes it happen. And he was the guy on almost all those things, if not all of them. If you go back and say, if he hadn't been there, it would not have happened, or would happen later, or to a lesser degree, on all these things. And so, the other thing I really admire about your grandfather is that it's pretty rare that you see people that have this big vision, so big that some people think he's starry-eyed, dreamer, unrealistic, but yet the attention to detail. And I remember some of the reports when that big night when he opened the Woodruff building and Hotel Sansone, and I think the newspaper, so like 3 buildings were opening downtown, and they drew like 10,000 people from like 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. on a January night, maybe it was early February, downtown to tour these buildings. And one of the newspaper reports said, it was like, well, we kind of wish we'd seen more of John T. Woodruff, but he was running around, attending to details about this event. He was not just, he had the attention to detail and yet the big vision. And it's pretty rare that you, and the sustained effort to keep it going for 40 years through thick and thin, and, war and depression and the Depression, the Great Depression, and all the things that happened. It's just amazing life. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, it's something that you didn't mention.
Uh-huh.
He was instrumental in having the medical center
Yes.
brought here.
Yes, he was.
And that of course
Still in existence.
still in existence, and we may like it or not like it, but it does bring some jobs to Springfield.
Steady
Steady
source
jobs.
of steady good jobs. It's also brought a colorful cast of characters who
There have been
incarcerated here.
Yes, and their families, of course, come and spend their money, and
Yeah.
some of them we probably prefer not to see.
Yeah. But also with the O'Reilly Hospital, again, I've only been here 3 years, but when I sort of ask people, well, how did you, are you native Ozark or no? Well, how'd you end up here? Well, my uncle was recuperating at O'Reilly. Or, again, that brought a lot of people to the area. It didn't last very long, but it did bring a lot of people to the area, the O'Reilly Hospital.
Yeah, my grandfather, my mother's father, was with the railroad.
Uh-huh.
And I remember stories from my mom and dad that if they were going to St. Louis or New York or wherever, my grandfather had his own car.
Oh, really?
And they would just hook the car on the end of the train.
Yeah.
And they had, he said it was like you might see in the movies that they had I don't know, would it be a porter?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
in their car
Yeah.
that took care of their food and everything. They had bedrooms in there, and I guess it was
Yeah.
quite large, a living room, and they didn't ride with everyone else. They just rode there in their own car, and then when they would get to wherever they were going, they would park that car, and they would not go to a hotel. They would
Just
stay in
stay
their
there.
car
They just stay there.
because it had full facilities
It
in
was
it.
that rolling hotel room.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that he did not. I mean, he left the Frisco, but it was not. It was an amicable departure of the ways, and I'm still impressed that he resigned from the Frisco in 1909, I believe it was, and then a year later he built an office building. He rented it to his former employer. I just think that's great that you say, I'm going to go my own direction. What I'm going to do is build an office building. I'm going to release it back to you guys.
That's right. And it worked.
Yeah, I know. So I haven't found any, no skeletons in the closet, no major things about your grandfather. Maybe the most, it's not a big thing, but did anybody ever talk about the Ha Tonka trial?
I heard a little bit, not enough to know anything.
Yeah.
No.
Here's the little I know, and it's not corroborated or cross-checked or anything, but the Snyder family had built Ha Tonka starting back in about 1904. So when Bagnell Dam was being built, it was going to flood out Lynn Creek, which was the county seat of Camden County, hence Camdenton. Became the county seat, new county seat. It wasn't just hence; there was a pretty bitter struggle, and your grandfather was in the throes of that. But but most of those farmers, they offered him some compensation, whether it's fair or not is let history decide. But the Snyder family was a wealthy family from Kansas City, and they said basically to the electric company who was building Bagnell Dam, "You've ruined the value of our property, and you owe us $1.3 million, and we're going to sue you." And I think the electric company had offered like $230,000. Now, granted, this is early 30s, part of the Depression, so you're
Right, and that was $230,000.
Talking about a lot of money.
Millions today.
Yeah, talking about a lot of money. So they went to court, and they had like an ex-Missouri U.S. senator from Missouri, retired, was one of the
Attorneys.
part of the attorney legal team for the Snyder family. And the electric company had their own legal team, and they called your grandfather as a witness about the building of this dam and this reservoir, did it increase the value of this property, Ha Tonka, or did it decrease? And that was sort of the basic issue, as I understand it. And your grandfather testified that it had increased the value of the property. And then the former U.S. Senator, or one of his fellow attorneys, accused your grandfather of receiving perhaps a bribe of $500 to testify on behalf of the electric company. And your grandfather, I rarely had read anything. Your grandfather typically did not,
Show emotion.
Show emotion. Did not, rake anybody over the coals. He was not. It didn't seem like he was process oriented. It was all about outcome, and let's keep the goal in mind here. Very forward thinking person. But he said some stuff about that ex-U.S. senator, that he was kind of, a doddering old fool, and he's just making trouble for everybody. And I can't see that it ever was categorically resolved whether or not your grandfather had ever received something like a payment for his testimony. That's really the worst. That's sort of the most, that's the worst thing I've ever heard about your grandfather.
My grandfather and my dad were just, of course I know this about my dad, but I don't know for sure about my grandfather. My dad was probably the most even-tempered. I never saw, he would just tell somebody what was going to happen, and it happened. I think you get a lot further with kindness than you do being a bully.
Right.
But, I will say that if someone tried to bully him, it never turned out in their favor. It was just, my childhood was phenomenal. I was born late in my mom and dad's lives. I mean, they had me when they were in their late 30s.
Yeah.
And, my dad was already successful.
Yeah.
So, I had a grand life as a child.
Yeah. And you're an only child, right?
And I'm an only child, and that probably made it worse.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I had everything, and
I'm sure they loved you dearly.
It was a childhood that dreams are made of.
Yeah.
We spent every Christmas in Florida, and my dad and I loved to fish, and we would actually take our boat to Florida, and we had the same house down there, and just would spend our afternoons fishing.
Yeah.
And we would drive to Florida. We didn't fly, because my dad felt like I saw more of the country driving. And back then, flying was a real expense.
Yeah.
And we just really didn't need to do that.
Yeah.
So we'd go down and spend the month of December in Florida, and just had a great time.
Yeah.
And we had a houseboat at Bull Shoals that was my dad bought the day I was born. And it was not the houseboat that you may be thinking of. It was a house on barrels. And it was a 2-bedroom home on barrels, and my dad was pretty handy, and probably because his grandfather or his dad made him do all the work at the hotels, but he would work on that thing and re-roof it and make sure the deck was good, and just was very handy. And we had a pontoon boat and a couple of fishing boats down there. And
but you actually had a floating house.
We actually had a floating house that
on Bull Shoals.
On Bull Shoals, and it was there was a friend of the family's. It was a doctor that had one just like it next door.
Yeah.
And the Murray family, Bob Murray, Realty, had another one. And, we just all were friends and hung around in there. So I pretty much grew up on the lake. I was driving my own boat at 7 years old and just cruising around. So, I've always been around the water and just loved it. But Gosh, we never, we didn't go to any exotic places. We just, really, when I was
Florida,
Florida, Bull Shoals, when I was, we had a little house or a double wide trailer at Fellows Lake.
Really? Which side? The north side?
When you pull in the gate to go down to the dock, on the left hand side, CU had not bought this little corner, and we had that corner.
Really?
With the Negler family, and we both had a trailer.
You had lake access from your
You
property?
could walk right down the hill of the lake after the gate was closed. And that was actually the Kurt Negler owned the boat dock. So that was my first job, 50 cents an hour, cleaning boats at the lake. And my whole thing was, the reason I had that job was because I wanted a mini bike. And of course I was younger then. And
yeah, I remember mini
so
bikes. Yeah.
50 cents an hour, as many hours as I could get, every weekend, all summer. And my dad said, if you can save half of what that mini bike costs, I will get you that mini bike. It was a Honda made a mini bike. So, and his feeling was he'll get tired of working, he'll never get there. And I had this bucket at the house, and we lived on Delaware, and in the old Fairbanks home. And my parents, were social, and they had parties, and we had a pool in the backyard, and they had this big summer party, and I had this bucket. It said mini bike fun.
So, I think that the Woodruff family is very high integrity. I do know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that your grandfather was really the paragon of what we call today civic achievement and civic engagement. He was really, he really thought that families and towns were really the bedrock of society and of a nation, of everything. And that's what he believed it, and he worked to make that the best it could be, in my opinion. So thanks very much.
Well, you're welcome.